Hello and welcome. I'm Dr. Marcelo Windmuller Campioni, an assistant professor at the University of Minnesota in the Department of Forest Resources. Today's lecture is on silviculture terminology. This lecture is a part of a series of lectures on silviculture terminology, concepts, and theory, produced in collaboration with Dr. Eli Sagor and the Sustainable Forest Education Cooperative. The goals of this lecture are pretty straightforward. We're going to introduce or reintroduce some important terminology for silviculture. This lecture is extremely content heavy, so not to scare you away, but the beauty of video lectures is that you can pause at any point in time. That being said, there's also going to be a lot of terms presented here. I'm going to do my best not to read these terms to you. Instead, I'm going to allow you to pause the lecture, read them yourself, and write down thoughts and notes for each term. So my goal is to really introduce some concepts and talk through some concepts, but not read a bunch of definitions to you. So that being said, why you want to listen to these definitions, why you want to read these definitions, is that silviculture has its own language, and it's really important to have a firm grasp of this language, especially when thinking about developing silviculture prescriptions. So this language is key, and it really communicates important concepts and theories and ideas from silviculture in very concise words. So, for the next 20 or so minutes, we're going to be talking about silviculture terminology. I'm going to ask you questions throughout the lecture, so please feel free to pause the lecture and think critically either about the question or try to answer this the best you can before the lecture moves on. So, let's get started. So, what is silviculture? So, hopefully, two words might be coming into your head about silviculture. It's the art and science of controlling the establishment, growth, composition, health, and quality of forests to meet diverse needs and values of landowners. So this definition and all the definitions throughout this lecture come from the Dictionary of Forestry. They're either straight from the Dictionary of Forestry or have been slightly adapted to fit the needs, especially fit to make these definitions very concise. So, art and science. There are decades and decades of research on silviculture. Silviculture, this research includes establishment, harvesting, how trees grow, artificial regeneration, natural regeneration. And I'm throwing all these kind of terms that we're going to be talking about. But I'm doing this because there is just so much research out there on understanding the ecology, the silvics of how trees grow and establish. But a really important part of silviculture is this art. So each stand is diverse. Each stand has a unique history of how it's developed, the disturbance regimes that shape the stand, where it's going in the future, where it is right now. So there's a real art. And of course, no stand is homogeneous. There's always spots or pockets that are slightly different. So when developing a prescription, you really have to know the stand, know what it is, where it's going, and use that information combined with the science to develop this silviculture prescription. So there's this very firm research component in the ecology. There's also a huge component on the societal aspect, the social science, the diverse needs and values of landowners. So silviculture really combines multiple disciplines when thinking about how we manage our systems, how we develop these management plans. So that being said, I want to highlight this diagram, which really captures this idea that silviculture draws from multiple disciplines, and for some of us, silviculture is the center of the world. So this diagram was actually developed by a biometrician, and he put silviculture in the center because it draws on so many different different aspects. So whether different different disciplines, including forest pathology, botany, timber harvesting, forest law, forest history, policy. It brings all these disciplines together when you're thinking about how do I develop a prescription, what's important to me, and how do I develop this management plan for this stand. So there are 3 parts of a silviculture system. So pause the lecture and write those 3 parts that need to happen in every system. So as we unpause the lecture, let's go through what has to happen in a silviculture system. So we need to regenerate the stand. So we need to start a new cohort. We need to tend the stand. So we need to improve what's already there. And then finally, we need to do our regeneration harvest. And we'll talk about how these 3 parts of a system can be different depending on whether we're working in uneven aged or even aged system. So again, I'm throwing some of these terms out there before we've gone over them. So those of you that this is a reintroduction, hopefully that's reminding you of some of those terms. Those of you, if this terminology is all new, don't worry, we'll be going through all these terms in detail. So to kind of summarize, regeneration, tending, and a regeneration harvest, these are the 3 components that you as a silviculturist, you as a forest manager, need to consider over the lifetime of your prescription. So let's talk about these 3 parts and let's define them. So we can define regeneration in terms of establishing young trees, so establishing a new age class, establishing a new cohort. And again, I'm going to remind you, we're going to be going through a lot of definitions, so please feel free to pause this at any time to read the full definition. Tending is a term, tending is our second term, so we went through regeneration, establishing that new age class. Tending is this term for enhancing the growth, quality, and composition of the stand after establishment or regeneration, but prior to the final harvest. So with tending, you're focusing on the trees, the overstory trees that are already established. So you're not focused on establishing a new cohort. So you're focusing on what's already there. And a regeneration harvest is that cutting method by which a new age class is created. So this is where in certain systems we start over. This is where in other systems we start a new age class. So again, the goal is to start a new age class. And harvest can sometimes have a negative connotation, but in silviculture, the harvest is a way to start something new. So you're not only focused on what you're taking out, but more importantly, you're focusing on what's happening next, what's regenerating. So that's the goal in a regeneration harvest. So let's put these 3 parts together. So we have regeneration, tending, and harvesting. And there's a lot of terms right here. So we'll talk a little bit about the different types of regeneration. We'll talk a little bit about different tending methods. And finally, we'll go through some of these different regeneration harvests. And you can see they can be grouped in these rough categories. And in certain systems, it works really well in this grouping. In other systems, this grouping kind of becomes a little more complex. And we'll talk about that as we go through. So, a regeneration harvest. A big thing of how we classify regeneration harvest is based on the age classes or the age cohort. So, what are the 3 different age categories which we can classify different regeneration harvest into? And importantly, how many age classes are in each category? So just to remind you of the official term for an age class from the Dictionary of Forestry is a distinct aggregation of trees originating from a single natural event or regeneration activity. So it's that grouping of trees. So what are the 3 different types of regeneration harvest and how many age classes are in each of those harvests? So pause for just a second. So as we unpause the lecture, hopefully you came up with the terms uneven aged, two aged, or an even age stand. So I'm not going to read these definitions, but one thing I do want to point out is so an even age stand composed of a single age class. So we have just one age class. Two age stand, just like it sounds, two age classes. And then an uneven age stands, we have three or more distinct age classes. So just want to make sure uneven age stand, we have three or more distinct age classes. And please feel free to pause the lecture to read these definitions carefully because it is important when we think about this. And then another aspect I want to cover right now is in the previous slide, there is mention of the term rotation. So what is a rotation? What does it look like in terms of growth, biomass growth? And what, on the flip side, what is the term we use in uneven age stands? So I want you to label what a rotation looks like and also what a cutting cycle looks like based on the figure presented here. So hopefully you identify this top figure as your rotation. So we have some kind of event, some kind of disturbance, whether it's human or natural, and we have this new regeneration. And there's increasing biomass growth. Maybe there's some tending that's going on here. And then we have our harvest or regeneration harvest. And we start again. Whereas with a cutting cycle in an uneven age stand, we're never starting from zero. And we'll go in more detail. But we have these three or more cohorts. And we'll talk about this in more detail. But we're never starting from scratch. So we are harvesting and there is biomass growth. And there is this harvest, but again, we're not harvesting all the trees because we have three or more distinct age cohorts. So, formal definition for rotation, formal definition for cutting cycle. So let's move into even age regeneration harvest. And I do want to point out there's some great figures that are from Dr. Jeremy Stovall's site and lab, and I have the link to his online textbook. So if you have additional questions or want to look at these figures in more detail, please feel free to follow that link. So an even age regeneration harvest is a cutting method by which a new age class is created all at the same point. So we're basically starting from scratch after our harvest. So we're starting this regeneration cohort. Again, this is one age class that started all together after this disturbance. And there's several types that we're going to go over. So we can talk about a clear cut, a seed tree cut, and then a Shelterwood cut. So we'll talk about these three different types, and we'll also talk about how these types are modified. So with a clear cut, this is probably the most straightforward most straightforward silvicultural system that we can implement. And it really allows us to see these three parts of a silviculture system: the regeneration, the tending, and then the regeneration harvest. So we start with a blank slate in our clear cut. So we remove our trees, we establish a new age class, that age class grows, we tend them, and then we implement our regeneration harvest. So we have each of these three parts of the silvicultural system: the establishment, the regeneration, the tending, and the regeneration harvest happens in three distinct parts. And we see that throughout the rotation. We see this increasing growth in biomass where we can do some of these tending. Again, tending focus on our overstory trees to where we have peak biomass growth, and we harvest that and we start it all over. So this is a really great way to see these three parts of the silviculture system. So one aspect I do want to highlight is this term coppice versus clear cut. So coppice is a low forestry method. So Coppice focuses on establishment regeneration using vegetative methods, so asexual regeneration. And in the lake states, in the western United States, Coppice works very well with aspen because it regenerates vegetatively. So it's a low forestry method. Whereas clear cutting is a method, again, where we remove the overstory in a single cutting method, and regeneration established in a fully exposed microsite. So I just want to highlight the term coppice versus a clear cut. So coppice involves this low forestry method. It involves asexual regeneration. Moving into our next silvicultural treatment, silvicultural system, we have the seed tree harvest. So a seed tree harvest is where you remove all the trees except a small number of widely dispersed trees retained for seed production. So the goal is to retain these trees to produce seed. These trees are removed. So again, we still have the single cohort. There's tending, and then we have our regenerate. We have our first harvest to establish our seed trees, to select which trees we want to produce seed on the site. Those trees produce the seed. We have regeneration, and those trees are removed. So this is a case where we maintain that even age system. If we left these seed trees on site, if we left the residual overstory, we would move this stand from a 1-age stand, so an even age stand, to a 2-age stand. So we have two distinct age classes. And that can be done and is commonly done as we want to increase vertical structure, increase the structure for wildlife. But a seed tree, so in a traditional seed tree, we remove these seed trees, and we'll talk about that removal again in a second in the Shelterwood harvest. So the Shelterwood harvest, slightly different. Again, we're leaving trees, but the reason why we're leaving these trees is not only seed, but also the shelter they provide. So in a Shelterwood, we have, this is a modified Shelterwood. So again, we have this establishment cut. We establish our regeneration, and in this case, we're not removing those residuals. And what does that mean for our how we classify this stand? The stand's no longer even aged. It's, hopefully you're saying 2-age. So we have a modified Shelterwood with residuals. So in a Shelterwood, we can remove these trees. So these trees are providing both shade and shelter, or we can leave them and shift the stand from an even age stand with 1 age class to a 2-age stand with 2 age classes. So now I want to transition a little bit to moving to our uneven age regeneration harvest. So I have two figures here, and I want you to classify the different, what we have here, what we have left. So which one might be a single tree selection and which one might be a group selection. And why did you classify these two figures in that certain way? So a single tree selection harvest is where we're removing individual trees from a stand. So we're removing individual trees that are mature, either or diseased. We're removing individual trees and focusing that remainder growth on what is left. In the group selection, we're taking out trees in groups or patches. So we're creating this broader opening compared to our single tree selection. Now let's think about the three parts of our silvicultural system compared to even age stands. So in even age stands, we saw each part, the regeneration, the tending, and that regeneration harvest happened in three pretty distinct time periods. That's a little different in our uneven age stands. So the harvesting, regeneration, and tending happen all at once. So it's happening every time we enter the stand. Every entry, every cutting cycle, we're harvesting those mature trees. we're regenerating a new cohort and we're tending what's remaining. So we're tending that immature cohort, we're tending that cohort where we're hoping to improve the quality or improve the composition. So we're trying to improve the stand with each cutting cycle, with each entry. So this is really important because with an uneven age stand, we have 3 or more distinct age classes. So we need to be really focusing on not only what we're taking out, but what we're regenerating. And that regeneration is key because it can be really easy to assume we're going to get regeneration in an uneven age stand. But it's really important to make sure you are getting that regeneration. So you're not just kind of continually removing one age class. So you're not moving a system that maybe has multiple age classes to a single age class stand because you're not getting good regeneration. So now let's transition to that tending part, that tending component. And we're not going to be able to go through all the aspects of tending, but I do want to touch on one of the main aspects, or thinning. So thinning is this removal of trees in the overstory, and we broadly classify these thinnings into 5 different types. So can you remember those 5 types of thinning? And with each thinning, what trees are you taking out? So take a moment to write down the types of thinning there are. There's 5 of them. And also think about which trees you're removing in each thinning. So pause the lecture to do this. So as we unpause, maybe your list looks something like this, where you have low thinning or thinning from below, crown thinning or thinning from above, selection or diameter limit thinning, mechanical or geometric thinning, and then finally free thinning. So let's take a look at these different types of thinning. So with a low thinning, I'm not going to read these full definitions, so please feel free to pause the lecture and read them. So low thinning, we're removing trees of this lower crown position. A crown thinning, we're removing trees of the codominant and dominant class to favor those within that class. Selection thinning, we're removing trees larger than a prescribed diameter or larger trees to favor those smaller trees. And this one can get a little tricky. So this one can border on high grading. So you really have to think about, so high grading is a negative thing. High grading is basically taking the best, leaving the rest, which is the opposite of silviculture. Silviculture is always thinking about that future, thinking about improvement. So the selection thinning may be the case if the trees that are larger are trainer trees, if the trees that are larger were used to establish shade or shelter for the trees of the desired species composition. So be careful with this one. This one's commonly not used, but just be careful. Mechanical thin, very commonly used in your first thinning, where you're removing trees at a fixed spacing intervals or fixed distance. This is very common in many different systems, many different conifer systems, to set up an even age site to get the desired spacing for good growth. And then finally, free thinning uses kind of all of the above, any or all of the above criteria to remove trees that you deem best. So removing the trees that will improve your stand. So this free thinning can and does happen in stands that are typically managed in uneven age systems. So if we think about northern hardwood stands in the lake states, we're again regenerating, so we're removing mature trees, and then we're tending these immature size class. So maybe you're removing trees based on spacing, maybe you're removing trees based on composition, maybe you're removing trees based on disease. So again, you're removing trees based on kind of multiple criteria to fit this needs. So, speaking about regeneration, let's move into what are the three parts of the regeneration triangle. So, what are the three components that you need to have when you're regenerating a system? So, pause and write those down. As we unpause, extra credit if you actually drew the triangle too. So we have our seed bed, our environment, and our seed supply. And this is a triangle. So if any one part, so if we have the inappropriate seed bed, that triangle falls apart. So for seeds to regenerate, you need the appropriate seed bed, you need appropriate environmental condition, and of course you need the actual seed supply. So we can talk about different types of regeneration. So we can broadly classify these into two categories, natural and artificial regeneration. So natural regeneration is, again, natural seeding, sprouting, suckering, or layering. And we can think about natural regeneration in this low forest. Again, I introduced this term of coppice previously when we were talking about a clearcut. So a low forest produced from vegetative regeneration. So asexual methods for regeneration. Or a high forest producing seedlings from sexual nature. So producing seedlings from seed. Let's move then into artificial regeneration. So this is where you kind of move the stand you regenerate the stand by direct seeding, planting of seedlings, or cutting. So this is, you're not relying what's on site, you are bringing the material to site, whether that's the seed, like an acorn seed, or a bare root stock, or a containerized seedling. So you are moving past that first component of seed supply for your regeneration. So you're bringing your seed supply. So as we kind of finish up, round up this lecture, stick with me. We've got a few more terms, but a really important terms encompassing all these different silvicultural systems is this idea of adaptive management, which is this dynamic approach to forest management, which involves this kind of continual learning process, this continual evolution of how we're managed. And this diagram really fits well. So it's not a linear aspect. So we're always learning, evaluating, adjusting, planning, and doing. So we're continually taking information and accounting for information on how we manage. And this is a critical piece, especially when we think about changes in disturbance regimes, changes in species composition, because we have this underlying and ever-present change due to climate change. So right now, climate change is really a big thought on our minds. It should be a big thought on our minds when we're developing silvicultural prescription. And there's a lot of unknowns on exactly how climate change will impact our forests. But this adaptive management cycle allows us to be okay with that uncertainty, because we're continually learning, adjusting, and planning based on this uncertainty. So I've talked a lot about forest management, forest prescription. So what are the parts of a silviculture prescription? So first we need to determine the goals and objectives. We need to evaluate the stand conditions, and this is generally one of the best parts, is where you get to go out in the stand, cruise the stand, really get to know the stand. You want to identify the options, and these options may be determined by the landowner, may be determined by your organization, but identify the options of how you can manage the stand. And then think about what the outcomes are, those options are, what those are. And remember, one of those options is always not management. So no management is always an option. We then want to drop the unsuitable options, describe viable alternatives, and develop a kind of pathway to help the landowner decide which of these options best meet his or her desired goals and objectives. Finally, you're implementing this prescription and evaluating the results. And if we think about this adaptive management thing, that evaluation piece, that evaluation and then potentially adjusting if things didn't go as planned, or learning what worked, what didn't work, is a key component. So what is a desired future condition? So it describes where your stand's going. So what in the future, what are you desiring? So this can be structural attributes, so trees per acre, basal area per acre, relative density. And a really key component of this desired future condition is making sure there's enough metrics, enough numbers in there so you can actually quantify it. So did you actually meet your desired future conditions? So now wrapping this up, so this has been an extremely content heavy lecture, and thank you for sticking with this. And really the big part of this is silviculture has its own language, and hopefully through the past few slides you've seen this language is really important and can convey a lot of information. And this is not only important for the theory or the research, but also the implementation. So as you're writing prescription, this terminology conveys a lot of information. So it's really important to kind of refresh or have a good understanding of this terminology before writing a prescription. So please feel free for questions or comments. My email address is here, mwind@uofm.edu. And with that, thank you for listening. And again, questions or comments, feel free to email me.